Hello, my name is Norman, and in this video we are going to install an Isilon storage cluster on ESXi 5.5. Here we have three ESXi hosts, ESXi 5-1, 5-2, and 5-3. They are part of an Active Directory domain, test.net, and we are going to configure a 3-node Isilon cluster on these three ESXi hosts. I will be using virtual Isilon nodes, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to import these nodes into the ESXi environment. To do that, I will create the 3-node Isilon cluster using Isilon virtual nodes. I will import the nodes using the VMware vCenter Converter standalone client. Start the client. Select Convert Machine. As a source type, I have VMware Workstation or other VMware virtual machine, and I will browse to the virtual machine file that I will use. Once I locate the file, I select it, select Next. I select the vCenter server IP address under Server and type in my username and password. Here I get the certificate warning. I will select to ignore that. And now I can select the location where I want to host the first virtual node. I will select ESXi 5-3, and here I can select the particular data store that I want it to run on. I will house it on data store 3. I can select the virtual machine version, and then Next. Now here I have the initial settings for the virtual machine, and I can go through here and I can select which particular ones I want to apply or modify. Now I will modify the networking settings by selecting Edit. NIC1, I will point to the internal network, and NIC2, I will point to the VM network. Now NIC1 on the Isilon node will be for the internal communication between nodes. In an Isilon environment, all nodes communicate over an internal network. NIC2 will be used for client communication, and that will be on the VM network. Here we have a summary screen. I will select Finish, and now the virtual machine will be converted and imported, and I will be able to clone it in order to create additional nodes for my Isilon cluster. I have imported the converted machine, renamed it Node 1, and cloned it 2 more times to create a 3-node cluster, Node 1, Node 2, and Node 3. Next, I will create the cluster. I highlight the node, power it on, and open a console window. Isilon is based on FreeBSD Unix. Once the operating system boots, I will perform the initial configuration to create the cluster. Now that the system has booted, we come to the configuration wizard, which will allow us to create the cluster. So I will select Option 1, create a new cluster, and accept the EULA. Then I will set the root password, and confirm it. Next, I will set the administrator password, and confirm that. Support IQ is technical support for Isilon clusters. I will select Yes. And now I will edit the contact information. Company name Test, Contact Administrator, Since this is a lab environment, I'm just putting random information in. Contact phone number, contact email, and now I will name the cluster. For the encoding, I will accept the default of UTF-8. Now I will need to configure the IP address. An Isilon cluster has an internal addressing scheme as well as an external addressing scheme. The internal addressing is for node-to-node communication. The external address is for client communication with the cluster. Here I will set up the internal address. I will select 1 to configure the net mask, and I'll use a Class C mask. The MTU, the default is 1500, I will leave that, and I will select 3 to configure the internal IP address ranges. Here I will select 1 to add an IP address range, and now I will add the IP address ranges. The low IP address will be 10.0.0.10, enter, and now I have the option for the high IP address, and so I will just backspace and put in 20 and select enter, and there you have the IP address ranges, .10 to .20. Select enter, enter again, and now I will configure the external subnet. So I will select option 1. Now I will configure the net mask for the external network. The MTU is 1500. I will leave that at the default, and I will select option 3 for the external IP address ranges. Option 1 to add an IP range. The low IP address I will set at 192.168.88.10, and I will backspace 2 spaces and put in 20 for the high IP address and select enter. Select enter again and enter one more time, and now I have the option to select the default gateway. I add the gateway address, select enter. Smart Connect I will configure at a later point. I will select my DNS service, so option 1, enter. I will add my DNS server address. Select enter, and I will select my search domains and select enter again and enter. Enter one more time. Now I have the option to configure the cluster date and time. I will select option 1 for the time zone, option 5 to specify Pacific time. The day and time I will leave to the defaults. The join mode can be either manual or secure. I will accept the default of manual. And here's my summary screen. Cluster name encoding, internal and external IP address ranges, the gateway, DNS, and the time. So I will commit the changes by selecting yes, and the server will reboot, and I will log in as root. And here we are at the command prompt, test cluster-1 sharp. From here I can run what is known as ESXi commands. In order to manage the cluster. One of the more common commands is ESXi status. The ESXi status command will give you a brief overview of your cluster status. Here we can see the IP address, some general cluster information, any critical events, any cluster jobs that are running. And now I want to go to the web interface and log on there, and you'll be able to do additional configuration using the web UI. The IP address for the first node in the cluster will be the lowest IP address in the external subnet. For the web UI, I can log in either as root or admin. I will choose admin. And select enter. Once we are in the web UI, we can get an overview of our cluster and manage and configure it using these different tabs along the top of the page here. The dashboard will give you an overview, cluster overview, events, access overview, EMC support. Management gives you access to things such as general settings, network configuration information, hardware information, different cluster jobs, auditing and diagnostics, file system, storage pools, smart quotas, deduplication, file system settings, data protection, snapshot IQ, sync IQ, backup and antivirus, access. You have the ability to create access zones, select your different authentication providers, memberships and roles, and you have your authentication settings. Finally, under protocols, you have the ability to create both SMB shares and Unix exports, as well as configure access with FTP and HTTP. I will return to the dashboard, cluster overview, and here you see we have one node in the cluster. Now I will configure the other two nodes and have them join the cluster, and we will have a 3-node Isilon storage cluster when we're finished. I go back to the vCenter server, I select node 2, power it on, and open a console window. Once the second node boots up, we can bypass option 1, create a new cluster, and select option 2 to join an existing cluster. So I select 2, enter. It automatically finds test cluster, so I will select 1 and enter, and it will join the cluster. Node 2 has rebooted. It too is a part of our Isilon cluster. You can see at the prompt, test cluster -2. Now I will perform the same procedure on node 3, and we will have a 3-node Isilon cluster. Here in the web UI, you can see our 3rd node is added, and once it boots up, we will be able to get the additional information that we see for the other 2 nodes. And that is installing Isilon 7.2 on ESXi 5.5. In my next video, I will join the cluster to an Active Directory domain, configure Smart Connect zones, SMB shares, and NFS exports. Thank you.